Now it's time to make 4 at a time flying geese, and this pattern will ask you to make 3 different sets of flying geese using this method. First, we have the fabric 6 bigger square and 4 of the fabric 5 smaller squares. Second, we have 1 of the fabric 2 big square and 4 of the fabric 6 small squares. And for the third flying geese set, we have 1 bigger fabric 2 square and 4 smaller background fabric squares. To prepare, I already went ahead and drew a diagonal line across the wrong side of each of the smaller fabric squares. To start making the flying geese, just grab 2 of the smaller squares from each set and lay them diagonally across the corresponding bigger fabric square. You'll notice that the diagonal lines connect and that the smaller squares will overlap in the middle, and all of this is supposed to happen. Leave out 2 of the smaller squares from each group for now and sew a seam that is a 1/4 inch away from each of these diagonal lines. Do that for all 3 sets. I'm back from the sewing machine and I've sewn a seam that is a 1/4 inch away from both sides of the diagonal line. Next, go ahead and cut along the line to separate each of the units into 2 parts. Once you've done that, take the units to the ironing station and press these triangle flaps open. Once they've been pressed open, they might look a little bit like hearts, which is really fun, but now there's 2 of each unit, and that's where these 2 remaining small squares come into play. Place each of these remaining squares right sides together to the bottom corner of each of these heart-shaped units. Then, sew a seam that is a 1/4 inch away from both sides of the line. Back from the sewing machine with a seam that is a 1/4 inch away from both sides of these diagonal lines. The next step is to cut along the lines to finally separate these units into 4 flying geese. Once they've been cut, go ahead and press the remaining triangle corners open. I'm back from pressing the flying geese open. I press them so that the seam goes towards the triangle flaps here. The pattern wants me to trim them to 2.5 inches by 1.5 inches, and before I do that, I want to make sure that this point is exactly a 1/4 inch away from the top edge. If I trim right along the edge where the point is, then later on I will lose that point when I sew this edge right sides together with another piece. I also want this point to be exactly halfway down the length of this edge. That means that when I lay the ruler on top of the unit, I want this point to be 1/4 inch away from the edge, but also halfway down this vertical line. Since this length is going to be 2.5 inches, I will divide that number by 2, and that would be 1.25 inches. So I will need to find that 1.25 inch marking that is also a 1/4 inch inside the edge of the ruler. Here, that will be the end or point of this white line, and that is the mark that is exactly the halfway point and is the 1/4 inch away from the edge for this flying geese. Match that point with the tip of the triangle, then match the 1.5 inch marker with these corners. Go ahead and give it a trim along the 2 edges of your ruler. At this moment, you can see that this point is exactly a 1/4 inch away from the edge, ready to make a nice point when you sew it right sides together with another piece. And it's time to rotate the unit. When you line up the fresh edges with the 1.5 and 2.5 inch markers of the ruler, you will notice that the piece of the point of the triangle is a 1/4 inch away from that inner edge. Match up these corners again, and then trim along the 2 edges to end up with a 2.5 inch wide and 1.5 inch tall flying geese. Just to recap, make sure this point is a 1/4 inch away from the top and right in the center of the flying geese, which should be 1.25 inch away from both sides, making this a 2.5 inch by 1.5 inch flying geese. Repeat to trim the remaining flying geese in the same manner. Now I'm at the part of the pattern where we're making unit 1, and I'm about to sew this right sides together to this unit, and I want to make sure you know the reason why we trimmed so that this triangle point is a 1/4 inch away from the edge. When you place the pieces right sides together, try to make it a habit of placing the flying geese with the point on top so that you can make sure that your seam intersects with the lines over here. I'll show you over at the sewing machine. I'm about to sew these two pieces right sides together, but before I do that, I will flip it over so that the flying geese is on top. When this unit goes under the needle, I want to make sure that my seam intersects the 2 points of the seam right here. Take your time and go slowly. Here's the unit fresh off the machine. When I open these pieces back up, you'll see that sewing at the intersection helped me to make sure that the point of the triangle goes right up to the edge of the next piece of fabric, setting your block up for some nice and crisp points.